I hope that this doesn't bore the learned among you, but I do think it important that the story be told outside the walls of analytic philosophy. In the coffee break, one of you asked me whether the story you had heard was true, that Al and I were the only two students in a philosophy course taught at Calvin College by Harry Gelman, and that is true. We both had German copies of the Pure Critique and the Kemp-Smith translation, took them both to class, but somebody told me recently that Al's wife, Kathy, told him that though Al carried around his German copy, he never actually used it. Not only have Al and I known each other then since the fall of 1950, we've been close friends ever since. It was, as I recall, friendship at first sight. We then taught together at Yale in the academic year 1957 to 58, and we were colleagues on the faculty of Calvin from 1963 to 1982. So though I aim to make my description of Al's influence on philosophy accurate and not overstated, I don't pretend that it's objective. If by objective you mean detached. If the opposite of detached is attached, then this will be an attached narrative. And I will continue to refer to the subject of my narrative not as Professor Plantinga, nor as Plantinga, nor even as Alvin, but as Al. No disrespect intended. So what was the ethos of American philosophy in the early 1950s? If I am anywhere near successful in my description, the ethos of those times will seem strange, alien, and unfamiliar to every philosopher here under the age of 55. The change over these 50 years has been enormous. My description will fit Harvard, where I was a grad student, somewhat better than it fits Yale, where Al was a grad student. Yale was old-fashioned in those days, not quite up to speed. But once Al left grad school and began teaching at Wayne State, the ethos in which he found himself there was pretty much the same as that in which I had found myself at Harvard. What Richard Rorty called the linguistic turn in philosophy was in full flower at Harvard and elsewhere in the mid-1950s. Previously, philosophers in the analytic tradition had typically described what they were doing as conceptual analysis, and we still have some anthologies which described it that way. But now the talk was all about language. Quine was giving the lectures that eventuated in his book, Word and Object. J.L. Austin was visiting at Harvard, one of my years there, and giving the lectures that eventuated in his book, How to Do Things with Words. Charles Stevenson was visiting and lecturing on the language of ethics. Shortly, Monroe Beardsley would publish his book, Aesthetics, on the language of art criticism, and so forth. There was no course at Harvard on philosophy of religion, at least none that caught my attention, but there was talk in the air about religious language. In 1955, there appeared the collection edited by Flew and McIntyre, New Essays in Philosophical Theology. The title is quite misleading. With few exceptions, the essays are not about God. They are worried reflections on whether it is even possible to speak about God. When it came to philosophy of science, the talk was hardly at all about the language of science, however, but instead of what was called the logic of science. People in the field took for granted that there is such a thing as the logic of science, and declared that it was the task of philosophers to extract that logic and show that it really is the logic of science. And this was thought to be in those days mind-crackingly difficult, requiring supreme intelligence. Much of science did not appear to have the logic that one knew it must have. So we at Harvard had many talks in what was in those days called the problem of the counterfactual. It was a very hard problem. The core idea concerning the logic of science was that scientists form hypotheses for which they then seek experiential verification, or on the main alternative view, for which they then seek experiential falsification. The old view that they do or should form their hypotheses by induction was widely rejected. So let me remind those of you who find this all quite naive that this was before the days of Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, Van Frossen, here present, and so forth. Philosophers of science talked a bit, but not so very much, about the nature of the perceptual experience that supposedly verifies or falsifies scientific hypotheses. But it fell to epistemologists to place the nature of perceptual experience at the center of their enterprise, and to give an account of how perceptual experience imparts justification to perceptual judgments. As to the former of these topics, the nature of perceptual experience, sense data dominated the field, sense data theory. It was widely held that of which one is aware in perception is not external objects, such as cats and dogs, but sense data. And there was much discussion as to just what a sense datum was, and as to the reason for thinking that there are any. As to the latter of the topics mentioned, how perceptual experience imparts justification to perceptual judgments, the theory employed for discussing the matter was classical foundationalism. That this was the theory employed was not clear to anybody at the time, however. No one had yet identified classical foundationalism as a distinct epistemological position and held it up for critique. It was simply taken for granted as the obvious truth of the matter. Let me be candid with you and declare that I found the epistemology of the time to be a crashing bore. Not that I already knew the answers to the questions being posed, I had no interest in the questions. Whether or not there is an external world was a question that did not vex me. And the much discussed problem of the speckled hen never engaged me either. And I found that I could live happily without figuring out how sense data are related to the surfaces of objects. And as to logic proper, though the Harvard philosopher-logician C.I. Lewis had written his treatise on modal logic did not enter into any logic course that was on offer at Harvard. Nobody took any account of it. And that was because the concepts of necessity and possibility were suspect. Philosophers had no idea at the time as to what to make of them. Quine proposed that necessary truths are those that we would give up only as a last resort. And he held that the best that can be made of the dark doctrine that a thing possesses certain of its properties necessarily is that this is really a matter of how one describes or identifies the thing. His example was this: cyclists can be said to be necessarily two-legged, but not necessarily rational. Well, I've never quite understood how you can ride a bike without being somewhat rational, but such views do not prompt deep thoughts about probability and about necessity and possibility. I mentioned that in philosophy of science, the talk was mainly not about the language of science, but about the logic of science. And so too in epistemology, the talk was mainly not about language. But when it came to, as I've already indicated, when it came to ethics, aesthetics, religion, the talk was all about language. So why the difference? I think pretty clearly it was the influence of logical positivism that accounted for the difference. Positivism was in its heyday, even though, as we would soon learn, its death was imminent. And central to the positivist movement was the claim that in uttering a sentence, one has made a genuine assertion only if one has said something that is either analytically true or false, or empirically verifiable. If one has not made a genuine assertion, then, so said the early positivists, one utterance is meaningless. They were fond of calling sentences from Heidegger to illustrate their point, such as, the nothing negates itself. This is not, they said, an analytic truth or falsehood, quite obviously. Neither is it something that one could verify. So it's meaningless. Examples such as that one throw one off the track, however, of what they were up to. Because by the mid-50s, we were all aware of the fact that the term meaningless, as employed by the positivists, was a term of art. It was not their view that everything that failed their test was jabberwocky, meaningless in that sense. Nor was it their view that one should never make utterances that failed their test. They just meant that one had not, on their view, on their definition, made an assertion, a true-false claim. One's utterance lacked assertoric meaning. Now, it was near universally agreed by them that much, if not indeed most, of the language of ethics, of art criticism, of religion, fails the positivist test of assertoric meaning. We do not, they thought,